Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Grant. I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose, where we host in person events along with partnered and supported events, trips, and classes. We've recently relocated both our branches at Union Market and the Wharf, and we start hosting events there as well. For a full list of events, please go on our website, politics-prose.com. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you all to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. When we get time for Q&A, we have a mic set up over by the right pillar. Please speak clearly into the mic so that everyone can hear the question and it could be recorded since it's being live streamed today. Following the Q&A, we'll have a sign-in here at this table. This line will be over at the Q&A mic, and we have copies of the author's books behind the registers if you haven't picked it up already. Tonight, in partnership with the Washington Literary Center, we're excited to welcome Asha Thanki to talk about her new book, A Thousand Times Before. Asha Thanki received her MFA in creative writing from the University of Minnesota. Her work has appeared in the Southern Review, Catapult, Hyphen, and more. A Kuniman Fellow, Asha has received scholarships at Sinawani Writers Conference, Red Loaf Writers Conference, and the AC Boise Grant for South Asian Speculative Literacy. Thankfully, we'll be in conversation with Matt Ortile, the author of the essay collection The Groom Will Keep His Name and the co-editor of the nonfiction anthology Body Language. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Asha Thanki and Matt Ortile.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Is this one on? Oh, yeah.
Yes, she is. Okay. Everyone can hear us. Another round of applause, please, for Asha Thanki.
Wow.
How are you doing today?
We're doing great. We haven't sweat off our face.
No.
Yeah. Doing great.
Well, thank you, everybody, for being here on a beautiful Saturday afternoon here in beautiful Washington, D.C. And I think we're starting with a reading first.
Yes.
Is that right?
We will. Ahead. Because I'm not a poet, I'm not going to do a long intro, but this is just a scene from the first section of the book. In the late afternoon, the sun beating down and Bapu not yet home, Amla sits with her watercolors against the mango trees by their house. No fruit hangs from the branches, the leaves deep parrot and evergreen. She traces the outer edges of the splintering box with the soft tips of her fingers. She wants to make art, like all those women on the tapestry made art. She wonders how she knows them, how she can remember them. She starts in pencil with the moon, her mother's namesake, liking the way everything in a scene can be illuminated in a quiet glow. She knows, without really having learned it, that the whiteness of the paper will determine how much light comes through the image. She thinks of folding her paper in four, but doesn't. With her eyes closed, she forces herself back to those moments she cherished. She imagines the way the balcony railing pressed against her thigh and buttocks, how it hurt her bones if she sat too long, the way her left heel rested on the ground. Something takes a hold of her muscles. Her hands move without conscious thought, pulling a few of the lighter pigments from the box and dipping her brush in a steel water bowl she had brought from the house. Her brush streaks across the paper, a landscape forming on its edges. She loves the way the moist pigment spreads, vein-like and hungry. Her eyes grow narrow, honing in on the smaller details. She returns to the dried patches to add layers of shadow. How do her hands know what to do? When did her eyes begin to see the world this way? By evening, paper drying in the setting sun, a lavender gooseberry bush emerges, its shadows descending in violets and bluish blacks, a gibbous moon dancing in the upper right corner. The thin limbs of the bush reach upward toward the light, large parsley-like leaves bent, as though in prayer. The sky is starless, the single bush alone aglow. Amla wipes the sweat from her forehead, her kurti sticky at her folds. The sides of her small hands are streaked with color, purples and blues turning black on her skin, color under her nails, under her chin. She hopes her kurti isn't also streaked this way. She scrawls her name and the date on the back side of the paper, like her mother had told her to do. Amla doesn't bother to dust off her clothes before heading back to the house, the dirt perpetually clinging to everything. She rolls up the dried painting, her hunger quenched. She is filled with a calm that has escaped her for months. And still, her stomach twists slightly. She can barely remember what she had meant to draw, cannot remember the act of painting itself. If she made any choices about this image, she did not do so consciously. She had been driven solely by some strange, deep-buried desire. You remember what I told you about Amla's mother, Chandani, about that painting she made of her life in Karachi. There is truth to Amla's suspicion that there had been something there beyond herself, just as there had been when she painted the aunties at Ba's wake. But how harmful can it be? A hand reaching out for her mother. At first, the change is small and unnoticed. When Amla hears about the gooseberry bush beginning to grow by the Sitaful Grove, the way it breaks the gridded planting of the trees, she will smile to herself and think there is something magical in the air. Look, a bush that shares her name. In this village so far from the city in which she was named. How strange and beautiful for this bush to take root in the place that belonged to the mother who named her. Only when the bush grows large, disrupting the field's water consumption to the point that the Sitaful trees near it seem to grow weaker and drier, when the gooseberry bush dwarfs them as it claims the soil for itself, as it starves its companions, makes them thirst, only then will Amla think of the painting stacked among the others behind her closed closet doors and begin to wonder. Years later, an older Amla will look back at this moment of a child's innocent plea, of a girl reaching out for her mother, and understand how seductive this power was, how alluring. She will think of all the mistakes she has ever made, and then she will think not of Ba, as she so often had at that age, but of Bapu and all the ways in which she failed him.
A round of applause, please. Thank you for that reading, Asha.
Oh, thank you for being here, Matt.
I think it's really wonderful because I remember when we first met 2 years ago, we were at Sewanee Writers Conference and you were reading an excerpt from the then, it was already in contract. You were actively working on the book in revisions, I believe.
Yeah, edits.
Yeah, and you were reading the introduction and it was so just breathtaking to sort of, to hear you read because it's beautiful reading this book. The reading experience is fantastic. But to hear you read it in the way that you intend, in the way that you hear it in your head, it illuminates a whole other layer to the work. And I think, thank you for sharing that passage because, and correct me if I'm mistaken, this is one of the first moments where one of the protagonists, Amla, is kind of using her art to literally change the world around her.
Yeah, it's the first instance that she can recognize what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that could be a beautiful theme, I think, for us today, talking about how art can change the world.
Wow, yes.
But I want to warm us up a little bit with welcome home to Washington, D.C. Can you tell the audience, please, what your relationship is to this beautiful place?
I lived here for almost 7 years. This is my first adult home, so it's really nice to be back. I left only because I went to get my MFA in creative writing. Otherwise, I probably would have stayed forever.
And tell me a little bit about where this book was in your head, in your body, this piece of art when you were living here in undergrad. You were studying, then you worked for a year here, I think?
I worked here for almost 3 years. And I think one of the big things that happened was I spent a summer where I took all my PTO and I used it to go to a writer's workshop because I wasn't sure I was cut out to be an MFA. So I wanted to know if I could actually handle that. And so I was working. I had to stay at my job for at least 2 years because I had spent my signing bonus on a trip to India. And so I knew that I was locked into my job because I wasn't taking that ticket back. And so while I was working, thought that I might as well experiment and find out whether or not I really did want, after those 2 years, to to go and get an MFA. And so I was at Kenyon Writers Workshop in Gambier, Ohio, and it's a very generative workshop. You basically write a short story every day, and then the next day you workshop it. So you really have to not be precious about it. You're getting critiqued on something you haven't even had time to think about or time to revise. And so there's a 4-page version of this novel that was written then, and it was so loosey-goosey, right? Like it was, oh, like there was once a woman whose art was true, and like, you know, there's no politics to it, there's no history. It was certainly not tenable in the way that I would have liked the story to be tenable, but it was fun, and I liked the ethereal, that atmospheric, like, what if this woman once did blah blah blah. And so that was the original version of this novel, and so technically that was written, yeah, my almost my second year out of college.
That's amazing. And I feel,
Yeah.
do you feel, so spoiler alert for, well, I mean, try not to do spoilers, but there is an artifact in the book, a tapestry that connects these protagonists and the narrator, particularly Ayukta, to all of these women who came before her in her family, and that's 1,000 times before. That's where the title comes from. And so, in a way, do you feel there's still that connection to that younger Asha, who the one who was like unsure if this path forward as an artist
Yeah.
was tenable?
It feels like that line to me in retrospect is so clear that I have to be connected to her. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like the line is so direct from this version of me that was sitting in like a Gambier coffee shop just trying to write something. And it's so funny because I remember coming back from that workshop and immediately going to dance at a wedding for for our Bhangra team. And so it was just like, it was part of my normal life. It was like, oh, just you have to go to this and then you have to come back and you're immediately going to go back to work and you're immediately going to go back to everything. And it must have stayed with me enough because I did not know that I was going to work on this when I went to my MF. I thought I was working on a different project, and then something brought me back to this one, and I don't know that I was like thinking about it all the time. But in retrospect, I must have been. Like, it had to have been there all along.
I want to transition into why, in particular, a tapestry for this artifact, for the story, for the storytelling. But I think before we get into that, can you tell, please, the audience, we're going to borrow. So we're both based in New York right now. We had a book event. She had a book event. I went as an attendee, but a mutual friend was in conversation with Asha, and our friend Nancy asked this question. Tell us how the tapestry works. And I thought it was like a brilliant question. I'm going to steal it.
Yeah, and I totally should have brushed up on this in between Wednesday and today.
Because it was just like a off the cuff answer, and then
yeah. And now I'm like, oh, so because you have to defend your book, I know that I know the rules of this. So the tapestry functions, it's passed down from parent to child, or sometimes from person to cousin, or from grandmother to some, it's passed along by people. It's not necessarily gendered that way, but for a portion of this history, it is at least mother to daughter. And so for that segment of this history, it is often the person sewing the next person's image onto this tapestry. And that's how you pass along access to ancestral memory. And how could you have something so big that doesn't have even more to it? So that memory also is enveloped in the power to create art that could come true. And so both of those things go almost hand in hand together. And so some of the rules of it are you have to be sewn onto it in order to have this access. It does pass along a bloodline. So you are loosely related to everyone who has been on that tapestry before. And then if someone passes, it regresses. So it goes back to the person before them, maybe. And so all of those things are kind of explored within the book. Yeah.
There's this beautiful intentionality, I think, that comes with it. And it makes me think a lot about the stories and knowledge and just kind of advice and know-how and stories that we pass on within our families from parent to child. I think it's really interesting because it's like a blessing and a curse, right? Like you ask her, the premise is a little bit like, if I could know everything that everyone in my family experienced before, would I be better off for it? And all of that is explored in the book. But for you personally, in 2024 as Asha Thanki, do you have a stance? Are you pro Tapestry or anti Tapestry?
Ooh. Yeah. So, okay, I'm pro knowledge and I'm anti using that knowledge or like the power to make change this way.
Okay.
So I think that part of what I was interested in. The reason that I came back to the short story, the reason why I started writing this novel during my MFA was that my maternal grandmother had passed in the October of 2019, and that was my last surviving grandparent. She was the last person who had any connection whatsoever to Partition, and I had spent like a class in college. Father Kemp has a class called Struggle and Transcendence in college. He has folks basically go ask their grandparents in the 60s what they were doing. And it's a way to find out what your grandparents were up to during Jim Crow. And for me, it was a way to like have an excuse to go and ask my grandmother things. And so I had all these voice notes or voice memos of like my grandmother recounting things about my grandfather, and I ended up doing so much more work around getting the stories. And to me, it was just like starting this book was like chasing that. It was like, okay, my time is up. My voice memos end. This person I no longer have access to. What if I could imagine it? And then what if I could imagine queer ancestry? And what if I could imagine more greater connection to these places that I know people whose blood runs in my blood lived, and like what could I like if you just can't have the knowledge in real life. I think I was chasing the high of like, well, fiction, I can imagine it.
It's there. You get room to play in that space, in a way that in nonfiction. I mean, now there's a lot of
Speculative
work that's
nonfiction.
being done in speculative nonfiction realms, and so those lines are getting all the more blurry. But I think there's just like on paper, there's a lot of that imagination gets to run a little wilder. I mean, and tell me a little bit about that pursuit you mentioned. I mean, there's so many different directions this conversation can go. I
We can
want
go
to
anywhere
ask.
you want.
I want to ask about because without saying too much, very early on in the story in the novel, this Amla, one of the protagonists, just kind of inherits the power. The tapestry is passed down to her without a lot of explaining. She has to learn a lot of the ins and outs, the logistics, the rules by just kind of waddling through it. I'm not sure what the right verb is, but for you engaging, in talking to your grandmother about this and connecting back with that ancestral history, that historical context. Tell me a little bit about that experience of just like opting into the archive.
Yeah, I was probably really annoying in actually the voice notes because there's definitely an ethic around this. This is like not a formal like interview for like a thesis kind of thing where you're like, oh, I need all of these interviews to meet the needs of qualitative research. It was like, oh no, someone's telling a story and I'm going to start just hitting record and I'm going to see what happens and like follow it that way. So there was this conversation with my grandmother back in like it must have been 2016, a three-way call, me, my mother, and my grandmother, because my Gujarati is just not that good to like translate fully every question and every follow-up question that I might want back. But then I was in India in 2017, 2019, and 2022. And each one of those times, I found myself sitting on somebody's floor with my phone recording and just kind of like asking questions. Sometimes I was fact checking, like just looking for a place to jump off from. Like, oh, hey, actually, this is even funny. This wasn't even my own family. I just ended up asking, a beloved's like sister-in-law. I was like, hey, your parents, do you know if the roof of this place was oxidized yet? Like when you were growing up there in the 50s, like was it green or was it still copper? Right? Like how can we know that? And then I'll go look up photos. But let's just start there so I know what I'm looking for. Because if you're going to tell me that it was oxidized in the 50s, I'm not in the 70s going to like feel like, okay, I have to find every photo and find out exactly when this happened and when the rain fell and all of that. So I could kind of like gauge a little bit of it that way. I met with my grandfather's older brother in 2019, and that was almost like my first time fact checking a lot of the migration pattern, right? Like this novel is fiction, but the displacement pattern is true to my family. And so there's a steamboat ride from Karachi to Gujarat that my grandfather and his older brother had taken together just prior to partition. And so it was my one chance to ask all of these questions. And I was so glad I did. there's so much grief for everyone during the pandemic, but my Mota Bapu, he passed in 2020. And so it was like the ability to have asked those questions in 2019 and had them recorded while I could, crazy. Like what a privilege and a luxury, you know?
I like that you have record of it too, because I remember when I was writing my my first book, my nonfiction, I called my mom a lot, and it was just through conversations. And I don't know that I took active notes. I was just like taking things to heart, and I wonder if there were things that there's that tension, right? I think when you're trying to listen, when you're talking to your family, you're at the dinner table, a parent is saying something, and you want to be so present that you have to. I guess that was my flaw as a reporter. Like I didn't have a recorder running, but even that kind of like puts a filter on the experience. Like distinctly remember my stepdad telling me a story about my late mother, and we were talking, and I wanted to write things down, but I willed myself not to. Were there moments like that where you were like, this, whether or not you ended up using it in the novel, were there moments in this learning about the family history or just stories from, their lives before their lives before you?
Yeah.
Were there moments where you were just like, no, this is just for us. This is for me. I'm here and I'm listening.
I think the great part is that because I didn't start writing this actively until 2019,
Yeah.
2017 and 2019 summer trips were actually just prior to this book completely. Like I went to grad school thinking I wasn't working on this book. I thought I was working on something contemporary. I did not think. And so all of those conversations, even asking my grandmother, like, honestly, I'm not even sure how much of the assignment I actually really was able to do because my mom, like, it was the first time she had ever even asked these questions of her own mother. And so the conversation just became skewed. And I found myself, I was recording because my mom, one, because my translation issue. So I was like, I'm going to miss things and I want to be able to ask about
Smart,
them after.
okay.
And then second, because I was like, okay, well, if this is the class assignment, then I do actually need to know the answers. And three, though, it was like, my mother was like, she had never asked, right? Like when something is so hard and you just accept it, or people are so hard shelled that you never tap at that little shell, and if you never get inside, then you just accept that that's always how it's going to be, and you're never going to dive a little bit deeper. And I think that's what had happened with my mother and her mother. And so it was my mom's first time hearing those stories too. Like she knew the facts, but she had never heard them said with any type of adjective. You know what I mean? And then when we were with my Mota Bapu in 2019 summer, this is the summer before I went to grad school, the summer that I thought I was going to grad school and like not working on this book, working on a fully different thing. My mom was like, okay, we're gonna sit down and ask a bunch of questions because we got some questions answered back in 2016. Like, let's add more. Like, how often are we here in person? And that was my first time going back to India with my mother since 1999. And it was only my third time back in India total. And so it was kind of like sitting on the floor. We had like mint chai and just like getting these answers from Mota Bapu, his wife, their kids filling in, like huge. I mean, they're adults, they're my uncles, but like filling in and asking like, oh, hey, what about this? We know that story. Do they know that story? And like getting even more.
I was going to ask, like, did you find that once you kind of posed the question that it just kind of spilled forth?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I developed no interview skills during this process because I just got to sit there and listen to people who honestly hadn't been asked often about these questions, or maybe that like the timeline remove, the chronological remove from when it happened had finally maybe gotten to a place where they could talk about it.
Right. There's like a sufficient amount of, I don't want to say distance, but kind of like rest from the experience. Yeah.
Maybe even a resignation to it. Because I think, and there's the South Asian Digital Archive, ASADA, it's an oral archive of people's stories from Partition because it's a generation we're really rapidly losing. And so in that case, like, I was like, oh, I see how that functions. Because I was sitting in those archives all the time. This is me pointing at the hypothetical archives, the camera, and being like, this is just asking one question and letting people take it all the way through, because we all ache for like a story to be told, you know?
We all ache for a story to be told. Gorgeous.
Wow.
So let's talk a little bit about the story being told. Actually, I wanted to transition it into a question that I had like briefly discussed with you earlier this week. This is a lot of this is a multifaceted story. It is in one. If you look at it one angle, it is a historical fiction. There are a lot of historical events, Partition among them, that take place in this book that your general reader may or may not be familiar with. Like someone just walking into Politics and Prose may not, as you say, we're rapidly losing that generation. Whether or not a reader is South Asian, may or may not be familiar with all that has come before. Tell me a little bit about the process in the writing, maybe even in the editing, of how much that tension between how much to spoon feed a reader and how much to just sort of let context clues do the talking.
Yeah. I am I am politically oriented away from explaining for a reader who does not care to open up the internet. And one of the things that I was thinking a lot about, though, was audience. And so I was thinking a lot about audience as like concentric circles. So if somebody shares all of my knowledge and research, if they also share my identity locations, every intersection, then maybe every single moment is not lost to them, right? Like maybe they catch every single little detail. But wild to assume that everyone is me. And so
They wish.
Yeah. Oh, sweet. But then like every circle further outside is the idea that like maybe you don't share this identity, but maybe you still know the history. Maybe you don't share this, but you still know this. Maybe you actually don't know any of this history and you don't share any identity locations with me at all whatsoever. Everything, what I was obsessed with was like everything should work on a craft level. This should still work from like a plot and development and thematic, and all of these things should still work exactly as they should still hold, I think, was what I was interested in. And it's like the development of like I think any writer who's like oriented around code switching. I was like, how can I embed code switching 1,000 times so that you get like 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 versions, and then it works each time. But there are some people who might know more versus less. And then the other thing that I would say is like in editing, there were times where, because I certainly learned things as I was doing my research. And so like a third of the book is about the 1974 student movements in Gujarat, which when I first heard about them, I was told they were the first successful student movement, which is like a wild statement. They were the first student movement to oust the state government. And it was this incredible reactionary movement to, the Congress Party, to the rising costs of goods, and to just the problem that was the way that the Green Revolution sometimes affected people who are middle and lower class. And so you have like the Kam movement, like Kshatriya, Adivasi, Muslim, like political groups, like growing out of this vacuum that comes from the removal of the legislative assembly. And you also have on the other side of that the root. That's how the BJP gets their foothold in Gujarat. That also happens. And then all of that together leads to the Bihar movement, leads to the 1975 emergency. I was like in that research. And luckily, when you have characters who are younger than you, you can take them through that learning journey too. So during that third of the novel, our protagonist is a 15-year-old who's coming into her political own. She's learning who she wants to be and how she wants to be involved in movement work. She's watching it unfold, and so she's learning as it happens. And so the reader goes on that journey with her. And then the final thing that I would add is like the beauty of like the novel is a fully told story from Ayukta to her wife Nadya. And so Ayukta is also Nadya is part of her community. It's not translating for a stranger, it's translating for a beloved. And in that case, like, wouldn't you want to share enough to somebody you're in community with or somebody you love to make sure that they are also following the story with you? And so in that way, she kind of is able to offer those tidbits.
The problem with you giving such rich, beautiful answers is that there's so many ways I want to take this conversation.
You can do it
but
anywhere.
I love as well the really human moments of of the code switching you mentioned. I don't know if this is an example of code switching, but when Amla enters school in Gujarat, and
Yeah.
there's a scene in a classroom where Bahar, I think is one of the
Bahar and
young,
Padma.
yeah, Bahar is Bahar the one to transliterate the names. Tell us a little bit about this. You know
For
which
me,
scene
this is really fun because
Yeah.
I have been sitting on Duolingo. Okay, so selfish. I
Please.
finished the Hindi Duolingo course. Like
A round of applause,
yesterday.
please.
Thank
The
you.
green owl is
The green
at
owl
bay
is
for
proud
now.
of me. The reason why this matters is because Gujarati and Hindi share most phonemes as a script, except Hindi has the line. And then the like is like there are some vowels that are different, but like largely if you can read one, you can just add a line and read the other. And so for me, this is like a joke in that I'm like this is what I mean by code switching. Like somebody who can read Gujarati will find this funny. I find this funny, but it doesn't have to be. But it's like they're doing a translation moment between scripts. They're writing both of their names side by side, and like Bahar is teaching Amla, who's 10 years old and new to Gujarat, how to read in Hindi and how to spell her name in Hindi because Amla has grown up with Sindhi and Gujarati as her primary languages. And now she is living in a place where education is in Hindi and Gujarati. So she has like one access point, but she lacks the other. And so it's just like a little fun. And then there's a moment where I think I literally translate like "Come se dice," like just like it's like how you say for somebody like struggling through the Hindi language. And that to me is again a joke. The book is not that funny.
You seem to be like, I'm sure you had a great laugh riot while you were writing this
Like,
deeply intense, deeply political book. But I think that moment for me snagged because in a nice way, because I deeply think that like translation is an act of care. And like you want someone to better understand the world or the world that you share, or you want someone to better understand you.
Yes, and I think it's also like we sometimes think that like translation. So I think it's true, right? That like translation as an expectation is playing to a gaze, but translation as like an active desire to bring my people who don't always speak, like who are my people?
Yeah.
Right. And like Tanais has a great quote about this. But like the question of like how do I do this type of work to bring in my community that may not be my community by some checklist on paper, but if we're in movement work together, we're in community together, if we share and like love together, then that translation is like what I want to do. And I always think about this because of food in the book. I've been recently told that the book has a lot of food, and I just like did not really realize that. Yeah. And I just was like writing about Gujarati food, but then what I realized was that I was like sitting in the like, oh, this is how you make it, because to me that's like I want someone else to know the flavor I'm talking about, and it's not for the gaze of someone who has that as an expectation. It's for the readers or the people that I love, where I'm like, I want you to know what I'm talking about when I talk about this thing.
And in those moments where you talk about how, for example, Amla's mother makes a certain drink versus like how her father makes it, I think those are really telling moments as well of character, and just like why people prepare certain things, like why they're doing it in that moment as a gesture of comfort, or maybe sometimes even putting a distance between us, or like, yeah.
Yeah. And the book, in the first scene, it's Nadya bringing home Thai takeout for Ayukta. And even the question of like, oh, this person knows exactly what I like. They didn't even have to ask what I'm going to order. That I think as like such a love language. And then there's a way to associate that with even the grief of losing, oh, I don't know how to make this thing the way somebody that I've lost knew how to make it. Yeah.
I want to transfer us a little bit abruptly to talking about the frame narrative. So you mentioned Ayukta and Nadia. So this is Ayukta narrating the whole thing. And so she's in 2018, I believe, Bed-Stuy.
Yeah.
And, talking about, partition era, like South Asia. And so there's a lot of latitude with which you, as Asha Thanki, the author, have about how you tell the story in the book using Ayukta, not a cipher, but just like the person telling the story on your
filter.
behalf. Yeah, a filter. There are certain moments that caught for me, in particular, without naming too much of a spoiler, a moment in Gujarat when Amla runs into her father in a place where she shouldn't be.
Yes.
And so, but then they have this conflict,
This is the door that locks behind us.
fight, a sense that she, Amla, Ayukta is saying that Amla remembers that this was a really intense moment. There's like filters to it. There's distance from the pure, would you call it rage, but just like the purity of a reaction of a child at that age, right? Like who doesn't really know the full context of the big picture. All that they know is that they want to be good. They want to be a good friend, but as a result, they've been a bad daughter in this situation. And so the narration is kind of far away from the heat of that moment. And it offers, I noticed, this young girl kind of, you give her the privacy of her rage, of her feelings. It's really beautifully done. I wonder then, were there moments where you're working within this greater tool, this machine of the narrator? Were there moments in writing the story or in editing the novel where it actually got in the way, where you had an obstacle and you were like, shoot, the way I wanted to pull this off isn't going to work because of X, Y, and Z? What was the solution?
Yeah. And I think some of this actually backtracks to, so the way that the brief context is that the way that the novel is framed almost feels a little bit like The Princess Bride, you know, when like the grandfather and the grandson are like in bed chatting, or like the grandson is sick, right? Like he's getting the story. And so you come back to them over and over. So one of the things that, when I first was writing, I had just finished Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, and that novel is incredible. Like Akwaeke Emezi is incredible, and the way that they wrote it is that there's like narrators who exist in different plurals, or like the way that they speak is not always singular, and I was really caught on that, I think. And then I was also, and I think these things go like side by side. I just read that, and I knew I was writing from ancestral memory. And so the thing that I was interested in was the plural we. And so originally, when I drafted it, like, or, you know, 2/3 of the way through drafting it, was telling the story in a plural we voice, still direct address, but no longer bodied in a time and a place. And so that became actually, like, I think it became untenable. Like I couldn't quite like sleep at night, because when you're not bodied in a time or a place, it's really hard to say like why you care about consequences and why you care about retrospect. Like if nothing matters to you, like who are you? You know? And so I think for me, like that was a moment it became untenable to have that narrator, which is why Ayukta came in. And then I think the beauty was by being in 2018, by getting past even by being so far past like Modi's first election, by looking back on this history of Gujarat, she was able to say, okay, 1946, 1947, okay, 1974, 75, okay, past 2002. These are the moments in like a particular subculture's history that like I need to also use to talk to my wife about what my family has been through. And then also because she's telling it to her wife. You know when you see like two people like tell a story and one person is saying every detail and the other's like, okay, but focus on this. She gets to do that part. Yeah. She gets to be like the better storyteller of like whenever you see people on a date or something, you know. So she kind of gets to do that for me too.
It's nice that they share a community and they have a shared context, Nadia and Ayukta, because then Nadia doesn't just get to sort of sit there and take the story.
Yeah, she has questions.
Yes, she has questions, and she can almost challenge the telling as well of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she does.
Yeah.
Which I thought was fun because I was like, how rules are, I think, interesting to some readers, but not always. Like, I think in speculative fiction, I'm not interested in rules being so clear cut, because I think once you start getting into rules and rules and rules, I think you're actually in a different marketing genre. Like, I think you're actually in something else. Speculative to me was like, okay, there's one thing that's different, right, and then everything else is the same as the world in which we inhabit. But Nadya, by necessity of, she's like indicted in this conversation. The novel is about answering whether or not they should have a child. Like, that's so real. That's Nadya's life. Like, she can't not ask, why did this work this way? And maybe not, you know, Ayukta's like, I don't know how it works, but I can talk to you about why this has happened. And so that ends up being this like shared space for them to have.
I really like that. One more question for me, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So please get your questions ready. I wanted to come back to the very beginning of our conversation, which is about art and just the power of art. Well, mm, two questions then, I guess. So my first one is that there's this really great moment early on in the book. Ayukta describes what it means, the feeling of that
When my
almost
hands are
fugue
covered in
state
dry
of
packing clay.
art, where she says, "This is why it comes to us in our art. I think when we are thoughtless, all body and energy, and then you start to see that in these sort of intense moments of creation. Is that how you feel when you create art? All body and energy."
Yeah, I think I black out.
That's so nice. Tell me more about that. I'm jealous.
I put on music that
Uh-huh.
is actually, and you and I talked about this once. Okay, when Matt and I met, one of the first times we wrote together, you pulled out a candle, and I will never forget this. It was like you were like, "This is the scent of my writing desk," and so I bring it with me.
Oh, I did.
Yeah, and to me, that my candle is like music. I listen to the same music the entire time I'm drafting something, in the same way that like something from 10th grade takes you back to the summer of 10th grade, right? Like I know where I was when Frank Ocean's first album came out. It's but it's like that, but like for the scene I'm working on. It's like, oh, like let me go back to this novel. Like no matter what I'm doing in my life, I come back to that chapter. I put my album back on. I'm immediately back in that emotional headspace. Shout out Pulaski at Night by Andrew Bird, like the EP. But like that, once I do that, when I was drafting this, it was like it was the pandemic. I was grieving and not in therapy. You know, I like it was just like, okay, like get your work done. And I would just not leave until the scene was complete. But I cannot remember. Like I don't think I like think when I
You don't remember?
draft like writing.
Yeah.
Like why that word? I love people who do like
So
anatomy of a
nice.
sentence from their first draft because I'm
No,
like, oh
it's
really?
painful doing
Oh
that.
yeah.
Don't wish that. I mean, grass is always greener. Yeah.
But yeah, that's how I write.
And then one question I wanted to ask you that I said I would, but then didn't. Was it always a tapestry?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why?
I think I think like anybody who walks into my home knows that there are like tapestries kind of everywhere, and a lot of them are ones that I've just taken from my parents. But like it's like, oh, like this was literally like it's like, oh, do you have art I can take for my walls? It's like, oh, there are tapestries that are like, sit in a closet in our basement in the guest room, and it's like I've taken like I have one that is like, oh, this used to belong to my grandmother, and I have one that I bought in Pune in 2017 just for myself because I wanted to have it, and so I have all these little tapestries just like draped over everything, and I honestly think that this is part of it where it's like, oh, it's a not like it's a pandemic process, but I was in my home looking around, and I probably just saw a tapestry. You know what I mean? Like I'm like, oh, I wish it were deeper. But then I think like that, like that seedling grew into something bigger as I was like starting to imagine the novel, and then it became like, oh, but it was never anything else. It was always art, and it was always a tapestry.
To push the question further, was it always going to be this? Well, no, because you said
No,
it wasn't going to be this
it
book.
wasn't gonna be this
But
book.
then now it feels like everything that you've told us, I think, today, and like from everything that I've heard
Yeah.
from you about the creation of this, your debut novel, I feel like it can't have been any other.
It's so funny because Rifka Galchin, who wrote Little Labors, has like a quote that's like, or she said this at lunch once, when she was visiting the Minnesota MFA. She was like, you just have to write the thing that you like feel like you have to write, because 10 years from now you're going to be a different writer and you're not going to want to write that thing. And 20 years from, I know, isn't it? But it's also like one of those things where it's like, oh, like I'm glad I like just gave in and switched projects, because I think the project that I originally was working on, like it's gonna sit somewhere, and if I ever want to bring it out, like maybe it's supposed to have a different version of me writing it.
It's
Yeah.
almost sometimes I feel the universe knows better than we do, or just there's something in
Doesn't
our
she
bodies.
always?
Maybe I mean she
Yeah.
does. They,
Yeah.
they,
Don't they always?
I don't, that's just me joking. Thanks. Um, I think sometimes things happen in our lives, right? And then you're kind of like waiting and waiting
Yeah.
for what is the story I want to tell, and then certain things just align, and I just want to celebrate how much of this has just kind of come into focus, I think, in the last, what is that now, 6 years, even
Yeah.
before then. It has started before this story. This story has always been happening.
Wow.
And I think we'll leave that there
Incredible.
and open it up to the floor to questions. But
Yeah.
one more round of applause, please, for Asha Thanki. Any questions? There is a microphone up here. I'm told this is being live streamed, so please speak clearly and with great diction into the microphone.
Hi. Okay, quick question. So I'm very curious about how you developed your characters, particularly if you faced any challenges when telling their intergenerational stories.
I think I was thinking a lot about voice. So there's like two things. One, because it's told, I almost had like this beautiful like tool or like cheat code kind of, which is that Ayukta's voice almost gets to be the voice of all of it, which was like kind of like a delightful aside, which meant that the 2018 filter on history was like always able to be there and including her tone of voice. But then I actually think that the challenge was like there's a third of the novel that focuses on this character Arni, who's coming into her political own. She's 15, and when she's fighting with her mother, I never more than that moment had to be so confident in both of their different voices. And so I think I had it written out like the emotions that were driving each fight. Like I think I just had it like next to me. I was like, okay, Arnie's coming from this predominantly, and probably a little bit of this, and also a little bit of that, but like this predominantly. And her mother's coming from here with maybe a little bit of this, but she's also thinking about, and I actually just wrote it out. Like I feel like seeing the words visually, like I love a feelings wheel. I feel like that writing it on a Post-it actually really helped me keep that dialogue straight. Because I think dialogue was the only thing that needed to be clearly in one person's voice, because otherwise everything got to be through the filter of Ayukta. So her understanding of that intergenerational story kind of got to color all of it. Yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And if you're trapped in a row, you can call out the question and Matt will simply repeat it, because I recognize that this is hard to exit.
Do you ever write, and kind of just jumping off of that, do you ever write dialogue as script, like as if it were like a screenplay or a play?
No, I actually don't like a lot of dialogue.
Really?
And script writing, as a result, is like the thing that I'm like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah, which is it's great to have the Ayukta function in the novel.
She gets to like fill that space or like kind of like set it. Yeah. But yeah.
That's my cheat code for the work in
that.
progress as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like we've talked about this.
Yeah,
Like we
I
both
like
love a
it.
frame narrative.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Oh, I think we have someone coming up.
Hello.
Hi. You mentioned a lot of people who gave you their stories. What do they think of your book?
That's a great question. So I think one of the clarifying things is that I didn't use anyone's stories. I think that's actually like a critical fact. Like the only thing that's taken from truth is the displacement history, which to me is also true to my own identity. Like the people I come from are people who took a steamboat from Karachi to Gujarat, and people who landed in the U.S. after. But otherwise, actually, nobody's stories are in it. There's certainly those conversations, because they were also happening before I was drafting, were just me learning about my family. Now, in retrospect, do they like become starting points for where I did my research? Totally. But yeah, I think it's actually like almost important to clarify. So I actually appreciate that. Like, it's important to clarify that it's like a work of fiction. And I think sometimes it's like, oh, where does it mix? It's like, well, the displacement and the identity locations of the characters are my own. But otherwise, it's not my mother's story and it's not my grandfather's story. Yeah. Yeah.
There's always an interesting slippage, I think, when you're a fiction writer, but then you openly admit to, drawing on your own history or like learning about the world around us. And then because of a fictional story is somehow rooted in reality, then that must mean there is some part of it that's true. And I think sometimes we've been taught to read like that, I think, in this day and age.
That it must be like,
There's some part of it that's like, was based in real life. It's like... I don't know. I don't love that.
I know. I think it also happens sometimes to specific writers.
Yeah.
That like intertwine.
Yes, absolutely. I think identity, gender, race plays a factor.
I will say that my
into
dad read
yeah.
it before I defended it, and that was really sweet. So did my sister. So it's technically, if it's both of our stories.
Did they give notes?
Did you give notes? No.
Official answer, no. I think someone we have waiting for a question.
Come
to
on in.
ask a question.
We can chat forever. This is the problem.
So I guess my question is, did you always know that you were going to write it as speculative fiction as opposed to just sort of a straight historical fiction idea? And what function do you see that speculative piece playing?
Oh, I love this question. Yeah. I knew that I was going to write it speculatively because every short story that I had published up until this novel was speculative. I love speculative. I love reading speculative, and then I was like, oh, this is my artistic home is speculative, which is hilarious to say now because I'm working on something not speculative, and I'm like, this is the test. This is like the challenge of my growth as a writer. But I think what speculative does for me is that we get to take these like incredibly human emotions and human moments, and then we say, what if we just took the tension and we increased it in an unknowable way, right? Like just turn the pressure cooker higher. Then what happens? Like what does being more human feel like? And that to me is like the thing that I love about speculative fiction. Like that's why it's like, to me, it's always like, you're just changing one thing. Like I'm thinking about like a short story where it's like, there's like a fog that descends on Bombay. And it's like, okay, now the pressure is higher. What happens to the way that we talk about class and caste and like a Gini index, and like language imperialism and memory, like all of those are like things that are true to human society right now. What happens to us as people in that when this external thing is increasing the tension, not necessarily like forcing us to say that the tension is just what already exists. We know what already exists in the room. I love the idea of saying, okay, now do it more. And that to me is like a little bit of what speculative fiction does. So I think I always knew one of the images in my mind when I started drafting, there is the climax of part one. So there's 4 parts. The climax of part one was this image that I had in my head from the moment I started writing. I knew what that first arc was always going to be, and it necessitated speculative. It needed a young character to not understand truly and fundamentally how something had happened and what she had done. And so from that moment, it was always going to be. I appreciate that one. I could wax poetic about like speculative forever. It's my favorite. I'm finally getting to read it again. I purposely did not read a lot of speculative and like political intergenerational novels while I was drafting. I was reading a lot before, and then I purposely scaled back while I was writing because I wanted to feel like I was in my own contained mind. And now that this is done and I'm like working on something very realistic, I get to like, I was just reading like Land of Milk and Honey by C. Pam Zhang. And I'm just like kind of like getting to come back all the way to reading my favorite type of book.
Where do you find the line is helpful between speculative fiction and science fiction? Where you're doing like, and just because of what you were talking about with generational stuff, like in Octavia Butler, science fiction, almost magical realism. Where do you find that helpful dividing line between how each might approach your writing, why speculative works better for you?
To repeat the question for the live stream, just briefly paraphrasing, and where do you, as an author, draw the line between speculative or other genres, sci-fi, fantasy?
So I believe really strongly that they're all marketing terms that like should not enter my brain. Yeah. I feel actually like quite strongly about that because I think like people sometimes, and I find this when I'm teaching, like a lot of students might find themselves being like, oh, am I writing into this or am I writing into that? And the question is like, if it's a genre where marketing matters to you to the point where there are rules that you want to follow for a particular readership, fair, maybe you want to think about that, but I did not. I think speculative, sci-fi, I think any like book club fiction. Like what is that if not a marketing term?
Upmarket. Yeah.
Like that's like this is it's like, oh, this is like an industry that like is trying to like reach a particular audience and this is their way of doing it. And I think that like writers, especially like early writers, I think spend a lot of time thinking about this when it's not going to be decided necessarily by you. It's going to be decided by your marketer.
Yeah. Your publisher.
Yeah.
I remember like that. I mean, I still kind of live in it just because I come from such an editor background. Like I
Yeah.
think about audience and market a lot, and I think that impulse when you're a younger writing student, I think, or like someone getting started with writing, is that you're thinking of the book, the book as product out in the world,
Yeah, and
rather
just
than
it's not worth
maybe
it
the
yet.
story. You know, which is a totally valid concern. But to your point, like when you're at that stage, spare yourself that a little bit. I don't
Because
know.
you'll have to think about it too much later. So you might as well not think about it
Ex-
in the
it c-
time where your like brain is a little bit more
Yeah.
unbridled.
yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, we have someone coming up.
Hi.
Really simple question, but what a beautiful thing to be able to do research and do that research for your craft, but then also to learn more about your own history. So, what does this book mean to you? Like, what has it stood to be for you?
That's a great question. I think that in some ways it is the novel that I could write at the time that I wrote it. And I already now feel like, I think you and I have talked about this. I already feel myself emotionally distanced. And I already feel myself as an artist like moving to somewhere else. And so I think it's been really healthy from like a tour mindset where I'm like, oh yeah, like I'm
This soul
mentally
thing.
elsewhere. Or just like I'm not attached. I think like the way that I think about it is like this was a thing that I was drawn to write at the time that I wrote it. And it is the best that I could do at the time that I wrote it. And I can be proud of it and also think, man, like what do I want to play with now? But I think in some ways, like for me, it's like the dabbling in, it's me kind of like almost getting to like have my cake and eat it too, where it's like, oh, it's a political history. Oh, it's an intergenerational story. Oh, it's about girlhood and queerness. And it's about like love of familial, of platonic relationships, of romantic relationships. And it's about home and nation and identity. And then also it's like, oh, but this is also, I think of it sometimes actually as like, it's a novel that, if I could do it again, would it have been the first one? I don't actually know because of like what it means to write like a novel about partition and about Gujarat in the 70s and about like being in the US after the 2002 program. Like, I don't know how much of that is like, oh, is this exactly who I am as an artist for everything I do? But I also think it was like my first question around like, what do I see as my responsibility as an artist and what do I want to write about? And this is like one way of hopefully many, or like at least a few like ways of trying that out. Yeah.
Other questions?
We've maybe got time for
That's
like one or two more, or
yeah,
we
have
can
a
land
cou-
on that. We can end on that one.
We do have some time. Or
See
maybe
some
not.
of you deep in thought.
Yeah. Do you reread the book?
Oh, you know what's funny? I don't, and I actually
for pleasure purely outside of
That'd be
reading
crazy.
events.
No, I've actually never read it for pleasure only, and then the only time I read it through after I sold it was like when I was doing my proofs, which means that I read it. I need you to know that means that I read it after the version that Ortile has in his hands. Like like the version that went out to book reviewers, I had not read all the way through, which is like maybe my bad. But I realized that I'd been editing it like piecemeal.
This
like,
whole
looking at,
interview
like-
is void.
No, but it's just like kind of funny from like a perspective of I just like didn't even think about it, and then I would like have an edit on one page, and I hadn't seen how it affected the next page until very late in the process, because I thought I was like all of the edits were like very like they were just like targeted like this line, like we didn't do a lot of big picture, and so it was like, oh, I'm just looking at this sentence, and then when I was doing my proof, I had it printed out and I was reading it like for the first time that way. And I was like, oh, I don't think I've actually done this yet. I haven't done that since I defended my thesis. I don't even think I did that before I got sent to publishers. Wow. Read your own books, folks.
Well, I think a lot of people have loved it and will love it, and maybe that'll inspire you to revisit what people are loving, which is you
Aw.
and your work, but you also. Another round of applause, please, for Asha Thanki.
Thank you for being here.
And thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting us.
Yes, thank you, Politics and Prose, so much. And the Washington Literary